Hello, everyone. Welcome back and a happy holiday season to everyone. Today we are going to talk about loneliness, actually, because A, it's COVID, and B, it is the holidays, and this is a time when people can get the holiday blues. It's a time of family reconnection, and obviously COVID has put a wrench in a lot of the plans that we would otherwise have. But even without COVID, holidays can often be a time of real loneliness, maybe because we're seeing people around us be together with their families. We expect to feel a sense of increased connection and intimacy, and sometimes it can feel like we're not getting that, or expectations aren't meeting reality. Maybe watching sappy Christmas movies where everything is perfect and snowy and lovely and you fall in love with the hometown hero can kind of actually make us feel kind of crap inside. So all sorts of reasons why people may be feeling a little bit lonely now. And so we wanted to talk about that and kind of give some tips for increasing intimacy, talk a little bit about how maybe we can grapple with our loneliness this season and this year, and talk about kind of what loneliness looks like with our patients, and give some recommendations for beating the blues. So, hello, Kibby.
Hey. Yeah, thanks for that intro. I just a heads up to everyone and to maybe validate people's experiences, but we've noticed a lot of angst lately. So people are just losing their shit. Like, there's a lot of people, their patience is running thin. They're finding themselves more irritable, more depressed, just not doing as well as even other years. I mean, holidays is really a big time for, kind of like a resurgence of depression and all sorts of stuff, for the reasons you said. But this year seems a little bit worse. Like, we're noticing with our patients, it's just everyone is, I kind of had the image in my mind lately of a powder keg. Like, people are feeling like a little bit testy, a little bit ready to explode around now. I think for a lot of the reasons we talked about, like, a lot of people are feeling lonely. This usually is a time where there's a little bit of rest, a little bit of reconnection, and a lot of people are not getting that period of pause and grounding with the people that they love. So if you feel this way, everyone, you're not alone. There's been something in the air, so just to validate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's hard not to. I've been feeling a little bit lonely. I'm sure you have at times.
Yeah, so things are getting worse now. I think, we're all getting sick of the pandemic and the isolation, especially around these holidays, but this has been something that we've been seeing, ever since this kind of exploded earlier this year. I think there's a lot of people out there who's experienced loneliness a lot, like even before the pandemic, but now we're really seeing the effects of it on a social level in this huge way. And it's really, it's both subtle and also really devastating. I think we just took for granted that we would have people around all the time, right? That we had contact with people almost too much, right? Too many plans, too many meetings, too many parties or whatever. But now people are really seeing the effects of loneliness. And just to kind of give a little background, loneliness is not just being alone. Loneliness can also happen when you're surrounded by people, or married, or have a bunch of kids, or have friends. Loneliness is a subjective experience of loneliness. It's a combination of sadness, disconnection, maybe a little loss, kind of like emptiness. So that's, in the loneliness literature that we've talked about, that has nothing to do with how many people you're in contact with, but it's just this subjective feeling. And what's crazy about it is that we don't take it as seriously as other public health issues, right? We talk about depression, suicide, all the different mental health issues or health issues we talk about, but loneliness also has a lot of horrible effects on a person's health, like depression, even your immune system takes a hit from loneliness. We know that thinking abilities and your motivation is affected by loneliness. So it's no joke. It actually has a huge, huge negative effect on our well-being overall that we might have never encountered before. There's some people who were never feeling lonely or isolated because they're really connected before the pandemic, but now are just like, wait a minute, why can't I put a sentence together? Why do I not want to get out of bed? Why do I not care about work anymore? What's going on here? So it's just like, I don't know, this insidious sickness that we're all feeling together right now. And it's a real thing.
Yeah. My first thought is that it is a real thing. I'm reminded of the study by Lieberman when he discovered that social pain is processed in the brain just like actual pain. So he had a study where 3 people were passing a ball. The third person is you, the participant, and the game is programmed to start excluding you. And the brain processed this social exclusion as actual pain, like made the same pain signals as if you were just punched in the face or something. And so loneliness is no joke. It's not something to just write off. The body hates it. And in terms of not being alone, I know for myself, I think the times I felt most lonely were when I was around other people. I think because of the contrast maybe, or because of the way you kind of can't engage with yourself in the same way when you're around other people, because you're putting on that good face, you're putting on a bit of a mask, and so that can feel really exhausting. And the third thing I was reminded of when you were just talking was that I think maybe one of the reasons that COVID increases lonely, besides the obvious, which is that it is removing us from people quite literally, and I'm kind of riffing here, but it makes it in some ways maybe a little bit harder to be excited about being alone, because I think maybe one of the cures to loneliness is kind of reclaiming yourself, reconnecting with yourself. And when you're doing the same damn thing every single day, getting that kind of melancholia and that ennui is maybe removes some of the excitement around just your own values and your own kind of worth and direction. And I don't know, I could see how that would make things feel even lonelier.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking about it. And I think that our normal day-to-day life and the way we have managed social connection is through the space and the personal contact and things like that. So when you're around people, and we had the opportunity to be around people, it's like that's a time to connect. And then now when we're home, it's a time to reconnect with ourselves. Mm-hmm. And now it's kind of diffuse. We don't have that, Zoom doesn't really feel like you're connecting to others, and being at home with someone or not doesn't really feel like it's time to restore. Yeah. So it all just kind of feels like, it always feels like you're a little bit hungry and never get satiated. Mm-hmm. That's how I feel, at least. And I mean, if anything comes out of the pandemic, I hope that we realize how important social connection actually is and don't stigmatize needing it. Because I think that whenever I've talked to people about my research interest, or even with my patients who are like depressed, and most of why they're depressed is that they feel disconnected from others, it almost blows people's minds to say like social connection is vital for our survival. Yeah. Like as human beings, like our species, rose up to the I don't know, status that we are, like developed and evolved the way we have, is because we've learned to work together in big social groups. And the fact that we need others to survive seems crazy. Maybe it's more in our culture because we really value individual freedoms and self-sufficiency and things like that. But when you tell people like, of course you're depressed because you don't feel connected to others and we need others to like feel cared for, they're like, what? No, isn't that weak? That's embarrassing. I don't want to need others. And it's just funny. It seems so simple, but yet this is really something that I think we have to reconnect to and remember that we need other people.
I'm just imagining how evil solitary confinement is. And yeah, I mean, I think about, this is like one of those weird things that I daydream about, because I remember watching Orange is the New Black and someone was put in solitary confinement and they absolutely lost their minds. And I was like, really? That's not that bad. And then I think I had an experience of like not having anything to do for 1 hour and was already losing my own shit. So it is depriving the person of something absolutely essential to survival for weeks. Yeah. We're not meant to be alone.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. I watched in the middle, this is such a mistake, in the middle of I think April, like in the depths of quarantine, I watched Shawshank Redemption. Mm-hmm. What a mistake. There's a scene where the main character gets thrown into solitary confinement for 2 months. Yeah. And watching that, like I had this visceral feeling of of pain and just I couldn't stand watching it. And he got out and could barely speak or could barely think and speak. He looked like he went crazy. And, we're seeing that actually in real life where there's been people who've been isolated in their homes for months and they were normally functioning. They normally didn't have any like mental health issues, but they have a really hard time talking to people now or putting together sentences or remembering when they showered or things that were so upsetting to them because they're like, what's happening to me? Am I going crazy? It's like, no, this is what loneliness does.
Yeah. Yeah, can attest. I mean, it's normal right now to feel like you have lost the ability to be normal around other people. Even when we see each other in person, it's like, oh, human connection. And then, we notice we're staring at each other longer.
And then comment awkwardly about how weird we are. Yeah, it's really cool. We probably are better here on Zoom with microphones than in person at this point, so... Yeah, it's also a funny thing because I had a interesting experience feeling really like isolated and lonely here in the U.S. while we, in the depths of quarantine and now. And then talking to my family in Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting to hear, especially because they quarantined earlier. It obviously hit them earlier, so they had a few weeks ahead of us, and so they were telling me their experience, and it didn't seem so bad. I mean, they were frustrated that they couldn't do their day-to-day stuff, they couldn't go to restaurants and things like that, but I felt like people here declined in their mental health and also in their distress way more because... Yeah, because for them, being quarantined alone with your close family meant quarantining and hanging out with 10 different people. Oh. I mean, all of our, brothers and sisters, the cousins, and for them, that's their nuclear family unit. Mm-hmm. And they were really careful. They didn't go out, but they just kept to themselves. So imagine the difference in more of that Chinese family who... they have a pack, they have their own, they have kids, they have grandparents, they have almost friends with each other versus here where it's a lot of people alone in their New York City apartment or just with their spouses. I mean, it's very different.
Individualism gets us again.
Seeing real downsides of that around this. Usually great advantages, but I agree. Yeah, and beyond, so we're all kind of experiencing loneliness now together in this kind of new situation. But there's been a lot of people who feel loneliness all the time. This is something that is their chronic struggle. I especially love working with these kind of people. Often they do tend to have interpersonal dysfunction, which is my favorite thing, which means just chronic repeated patterns of making healthy relationships, connecting to others. They just can't do it for some reason. And usually they come in and see us for anxiety and depression or self-esteem issues, right? Because they're like, what's wrong with me? I'm so lonely. I don't have any romantic partners. I don't have any friends, or I'm with a husband and I just don't feel I feel alone, lonely. And I mean, I think that should be considered more and more its own clinical problem, right? Not just the depression, but the feeling of loneliness, because it's such a burden. It's people hold alone, and every time they're even around others, they hold that in it weighs on them. A lot of them describe it as they feel like they're in a fishbowl looking out in the world, and everyone's hanging out and connecting, and they feel trapped behind this invisible glass pane. Yeah. And there's a lot of reasons why people would do that. I think the common one that I've seen is that for some reason or another that they've felt a lot of shame for who they are. Some part of them feels unacceptable or unlovable, or something that wouldn't get the approval from others. So they tend to hide parts of themselves. And then when that happens, when you're hiding a lot of a core part or even vulnerable parts of yourself from others, you feel really lonely. You feel like no one really knows who you are. You don't feel connection. And so, shame is usually a really big reason why people feel lonely. And it could look all sorts of ways. It could look like someone who's depressed and tends to withdraw and like kind of like pulled away from parties, or kind of sitting on their own, or, you know, don't show themselves or confide in anyone. Or some people are more explosive, right? They get angry and push people away, and it's the same thing. So that's the shame piece is a really big one.
Yeah, it's been interesting having patients, because I would say that is a common factor in almost everyone I see. And it can be difficult to tell at first, because they come to therapy and they're talking about themselves and they are discussing vulnerable parts of their lives. And I really like them. And so it's like, why are you lonely when you're such a wonderful person who had so much to talk about? And it doesn't come up at first. You know, over time you start seeing patterns. But that just kind of goes to your point, because with a therapist, people, not everyone, but often feel comfortable sharing things that they wouldn't with other people. And so we can see the vulnerable side. We can see, I'm putting this in quotes, but kind of the real them that they're just unwilling to share with other people. Also kind of seeing them on good behavior sometimes, not seeing the explosions until maybe later.
You're making a really good point that it is kind of funny. That's why I love working with people who are lonely, because they come in when you start to build a relationship with them, and it might take a while for these kind of patients. But once once you build a good relationship, they show those parts that might be afraid to show other people. Yeah. And usually when people show their vulnerabilities or core self, it's wonderful. Like whatever form that takes, even just sharing that with someone and someone receiving that feels wonderful. It really is the things that they tend to do in the outside world to defend from people seeing that is off-putting. Like there's some of my patients who come in and they cry, they talk about things they're ashamed of, or they laugh or feel joy, whatever, those hidden parts. And then you see glimmers, either, you see them in the waiting room or even in session, where they are cold or bitter or critical or mean or quiet, and that, they have the shield up. And you're like, oh, but if you only showed that part, showed the self that I know and love to everyone else. So it's interesting. It's really interesting what people do. And those people can, you wouldn't even guess from the outside that they'd be lonely. Yeah.
The other thing I notice is a kind of defensive offense. So like pushing people away to preempt rejection, which can look like being grumpy, or it can look like, no, I don't want to be friends with these kinds of people. It's too hard for me to make friends, because the kinds of people I like just are few and far between, and I have to find them and I have to signal to them. And, in other words, by dropping obscure references and kind of setting up almost like a booby trap in front of them, or an obstacle course for new people, so that it becomes, they're kind of screening them out to protect against later hurt. And that can kind of be difficult to identify for some people at first, because it's like, oh, that guy can't be lonely because he obviously could make friends if he wanted to, but he's screening them out. He's not being approachable. He's not, he's actively unwilling to go out and meet people.
Yeah, it's a self-destructive pattern, because they are rejecting, like people who are afraid to be rejected are often rejecting to others. And then they come into therapy, they're their wonderful full selves, and they go, yeah, people are rejecting me. I try to be friends with them, and I don't know, they're not responding. They don't want, we got into a little whatever. And the trick for us is to say, like, they are rejecting you. They are being pushed away. However, it's not for the thing you think. Showing your full self, and this is the scary part, showing your full self and all the vulnerable parts of you is not the thing that they're rejecting you for. It's the defense against it. So it is it's this hard thing where there is so much shame. So they have a hard time like taking in, oh yeah, there is something that I'm doing that's pushing people away. But once they are able to open up to that possibility, there's a lot of good work that could be done there.
Yeah. I even notice this tendency in myself. I don't think that this is really like one of my issues, but like when I go longer and longer without being actively social, I feel like I can start to shut down and not want to show people as much. And so, I mean, it makes some sense. It's just, over time we develop these defense mechanisms and then we get comfortable with them and then we don't know another way. And so they get entrenched and then difficult to break and lead to more loneliness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would say that in order, like, I don't know if there's like yet, I wish there were more good treatments specifically for loneliness and all of this. I would say that the way I work with my patients on this problem is, the first step is to establish that relationship, and it takes time. So for people who feel lonely and they start therapy, give it a while, give it a time to feel comfortable with your therapist. But then working on identifying these patterns, like what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of people seeing, in you? What do you do to defend against it? Like even all, like it might be embarrassing to think of all the different things you do to try to push people away, manage your impression of other, like close off, whatever. So noticing all those patterns and then working with a therapist to, my first step is learning how to be compassionate and accepting of yourself first. Like first show those sides to the therapist, be vulnerable, take that risk. Right. And it took, for some of my lonely patients, it took over a year for my patients to really show the sides to me that they've been terrified of, which once they did, it was this work together of like, look, this is a part of you and it's wonderful. And I understand it. And we're here like seeing it together and having them get comfortable with, just getting comfortable even with that side of themselves. Right. And then once we get more comfortable there, then it's like, okay, how can you show that to one person or a group? So it might take baby steps, but it's about like opening up to that side of you that you're afraid of showing and that vulnerability and then learning how to open up to others. And it's hard, but I've seen like amazing shifts of people who are like, I feel alone and I feel like I don't have any friends. I've never been in love to like, I've been in love for the first time in my life. I have a group of friends. I love therapy. Like it just is mind blowing to see the change in that. So it's really, I think therapy is a really good place for something like this.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think of a time when anybody really opened up their vulnerable true self to me and I was like, ooh, gross, go away. And I know that doesn't go for everybody because there are some very real concerns. People who have literally been not accepted in the past for things like their sexuality, their race, their gender. So sometimes, I mean, there are very legitimate fears. I'm just thinking about kind of sharing, what's in someone's heart. I wonder how often that is what causes rejection versus the defense mechanisms, the pushing people away. And
it's a real thing to be discriminating with that, right? Like, yes, there is a really sad reality that showing your sexuality in certain communities, cultures, would lead to rejection and pain and judgment. But then I think when someone just like, really, really withdraws and lets the shame take over where they can't even do that to anyone who might be accepting, that's where, then it's about like just learning how to find the people you could actually open up with. Yeah.
I did kind of want to just mention another way that I've seen this manifest is when it might not be that someone is preventing people from getting close to them by being kind of cynical or grumpy, or they're just sort of shy and shut down. Another way it can look like is just a mask of politeness and friendliness and perfection. So that person who seems perfect, seems really friendly, but they're not able to kind of get past the artifice because taking that mask off would be dangerous to them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Perfectionism is a major one because that's the thing that people in the world around you will reinforce and like. And a lot of people with humor, right? Where they learn how to be either high achieving, funny, polite, self-sacrificing, people pleasing. Those could all be different masks to hide other parts of their more authentic self. And yes, they had this, a lot of comedians actually have talked about this. So they feel like this disconnect between that a lot of people around them like them, but they don't feel like they have that connection. They don't feel like they're their full self. So they feel lonely, but liked at the same time.
Yeah. So one thing that might be useful is thinking about difference between kind of temporary transitional loneliness. So maybe a breakup or a friend breakup, or, you know, a new move to a new city versus chronic loneliness. And because they can manifest differently, and they can obviously come with sort of different levels of comfort. I remember when I broke up with the boyfriend I talked about in my last episode, actually, I just remember having all of this time to time to myself suddenly. It was very strange because I was so used to spending all day long texting him. When I was bored, when I had a bored thought, text him. When I noticed something, text him. Like, there was just always sort of this other person on the other end of the phone available. And I remember being like, how do I fill this time? And then I taught myself to play a song on the piano. Like, that's how much time I felt like I had all of a sudden. Just had to like fill this chasm. So there is sort of this eerie kind of newness to transitional loneliness, and something about it kind of excites me. So I get kind of excited about it because I guess it's just so rife with new possibilities. And even that example of me learning a song on the piano, which was Memory from Cats, by the way, is like, oh, it's like, it's a space to fill. And I know it probably doesn't feel exciting if you were in the midst of it, because it means that you're going through something, you're going through loss of some sort. But there, I guess I enjoy kind of looking for the opportunity in it. What can this become? What can this time and space become? And so one of the kind of tips can be to have noise in the background. So make that lonely, empty, dark apartment come to life with music, with podcasts, sort of reclaiming certain spaces for new activities. So creating that reading nook, having a painting nook, having, I don't know, like a meditation corner or something. So just really kind of looking at that space in front of you and saying, what can this be? And then turning the volume up and filling it up, and turn on the lights, open the windows, put up the curtains.
Yeah, and even around those times, those opportunities, it's I tend to reach out to people that I haven't reached out to in a while, like especially during the pandemic. I've gotten in contact with my old yoga teacher that I hadn't spoken to in years, old high school friends, completely new friends that I hadn't, that were passing in my network, but now are really close friends of mine. So it's just, there are opportunities to make those new connections to people, or, reconnect with people from your past.
I like that actually, because I was just texted by someone who I went through like a bout of real closeness with him years ago. We're texting all the time, made time for each other, and then, we kind of slipped out of each other's lives. And I just got a text from him, and never, like, I didn't think he had social media, so we had absolutely no contact. And it was just really fun to slip back into that old dynamic that I didn't realize I could still have. So it is kind of awkward and weird to text someone you haven't had any contact with, but I think it's less awkward and weird than we think it is. Like, it's actually kind of really enlivening, because all of a sudden you're like, oh, there's a new person in my life, and we already have this closeness because we developed it years ago. And it surprisingly feels very similar to how it did then. And I didn't even have to try hard. Just had to kind of put myself out there.
Yeah. Yeah, especially people are hungry for it now. So I think that we're underestimating how lonely we're all feeling. So if you reach out to people, the times I have, I was pleasantly surprised by the warm reception that I got from people that I hadn't spoken to in years and years.
Also, if you do think it's too awkward and weird to do, I don't know, part of me just wants to give you permission here. Like, some people might think, oh, why is this person texting me? But maybe that reaction is on them and not you, because honestly, it's a nice thing to reach out to a previous friend that you haven't talked to in years. So you don't really lose anything from it. So I don't know. Yeah. I'm giving you permission to do it.
Yeah, and I also would say that especially now, I think this is a really important thing for us to do now, is that we, during this pandemic winter, we're probably going to have a lot of contact with only a few people, right? That normally we see a lot, see our friends or family, but we might only see maybe our parents or a sibling or a spouse or, just a select few in our pods. And I could say that, you could do different things to deepen your connection and intimacy with them. And this is what I say to my patients. Really, connection comes from being vulnerable with each other, like sharing vulnerability, sharing parts of yourself with people, right? Like that's really where intimacy comes from. And actually, my our friend Caitlin and I did this with each other the other day, just for fun. But one example of a way to do that is, there's an article in the New York Times, you guys could Google it, is the 36 questions that lead to love. There's 36 questions that are supposed to foster some intimacy and vulnerability with a stranger you want to get to know. But it's really nice. They give you a list of questions to ask each other, like, what would constitute a perfect day for you? And you go back and forth answering that. And it's kind of fun because you might just end up opening, talking about something that the other person didn't even know, or just sharing some passing thoughts that you didn't think was important to talk about before in your normal day-to-day life. But give that a try. Something like that, where you just basically share new parts of yourself and be vulnerable with the people around you.
I like the 36 questions. I've done it a couple times and never finished it. What I like about it is that it's leveled. The first questions are not as intense as the last questions. And I think the questions have increasing levels of connectedness. So I think in the end, the questions are more like, what do we share together? Kind of probing that, which essentially means, you can kind of dip your toe in a little bit in the beginning and have an increasing sense of comfort while taking them. And you don't have to do all of them. You can save some for later. You can even just take a question from it and ask a person, randomly on a date. Another product is Kendall Long's book, Just Curious. It's a book of really cool questions. And, on my season of The Bachelor, she would just go up to Ari and they would spend their time picking random numbers and answering questions. And it's funny because it's kind of a hack. It's like, I want to be vulnerable, but I don't know how to introduce that. Here's this book that gives me permission to do that. And I didn't pick the question, but I'm willing to answer it, and then I'm going to learn. One of the reasons I never finished the 36 questions that lead to love was I was doing it with a friend, and our conversation just spun out within 5 questions, and then we just had an awesome conversation for the rest of the night, and we didn't have time to keep going with it. So they are great.
Yeah, and it's also, we've gotten into the COVID routine where the people that you're around, you talk about the things you talk about, and a lot of people kind of get a little bit like, okay, what more do we have to say to each other? You kind of get in a rut conversation-wise. So something like this can kind of take the conversation into a new path.
One of the ways, loneliness can just suck. It's allowed to suck. And breakups suck. Like, there's no way around that, really. There's a way, though, to be intentional about loneliness. And that can literally look like, today, I'm going to binge Friends episodes and order 3 entrees of Chinese and eat ice cream and cry it out. And I'm just going to give myself full permission to do that. And it's because it's kind of saying, I'm not going to feel ashamed of myself today. I'm not going to tell myself that I just need to get up and go. I'm going to soak this in a way. I'm going to do the thing and let myself do the thing. And maybe tomorrow I'll be intentional about something else. Filling that space, making new friends. And in terms of making new friends, one of the things that I hate right now with my patients is that I keep wanting to tell them to go out there and make new friends. And it's like, but where? It's COVID. Where do I do this? How do I do this? And so we're just trying to kind of brainstorm places where you can find new friends. And I know I've been suggesting Bumble BFF. I don't know about you, Kibby, But there is no shame in this. I mean, when online dating first started, everyone thought it was for losers and no one should do this. But I mean, my boyfriend Paul's on Bumble BFF. Like, if there's no place to meet friends right now, what's wrong with going on a dating app, which is where we're used to meeting people anyway, and just meeting people for not romance.
Yeah, I mean, even beyond that, if people are especially afraid of the health risk, there's a lot of stuff online. There's a lot of I know we're all have Zoom fatigue, so I get that, but there's a lot of online church groups. There's a lot of the clinics that I'm a part of. They say they have like support groups for like new moms or things like that. And at first, people find that weird, but then after a while, they start to make new friends, and they even like keep in touch even after the group. So look for support groups even on Facebook or online, or even your local clinics. And I'll also put in a plug. A big source of connection that I had during the pandemic are live stream fitness classes and yoga classes. So, I mean, I'll put in a plug for mine through Intent Fit House, my gym, and I teach yoga classes online. And I really wasn't expecting much, but I am amazed by fostering this like little group of people who I see now all the time. I barely see them in person. Some of them I haven't even met in person yet, but there's, we just created this little group where we all see each other. We all, I teach them a yoga class. Some of my yoga classes are a little bit more meditative. Like I talk a little bit more about all these topics, and I don't know. It's been a nice place where people can, break up their day with a little bit of connection to others. So, anyone listening, feel free to look up intentfithouse.com and look up my yoga classes or any other fitness classes. But look around your local gym that you loved, any other kind of like exercise or any kind of hobbies. Like there's lots of online meetup groups. So give them a shot. Like if you don't, there's nothing to lose. You don't like them, you can either turn off your video or not join them again, but it's been a nice source of connection, actually.
I was going to plug your gym if you didn't, and I am terrible with exercise resolutions, so I haven't been in a while, but when I was going, everybody's saying hello to each other. The first few minutes are spent really kind of connecting and talking, so I agree with that. I think online exercise classes are a fantastic way of meeting new people and connecting. I guess we should probably talk about how to help our friends who are lonely, since this is what this podcast is about. I don't know. My first thought is like, since this is the holiday season, we might not realize that the people in our own homes are lonely. We might not realize that the people who didn't get to come to Christmas are really bummed about it. Because one thing that can happen is, people might be offended that someone opted out of Christmas because of COVID. They might feel a little bit defensive themselves, but that person is probably really upset about it also. But I don't know, as someone who, I kind of get the holiday blues sometimes, I think because I was always single and the rest of my family is much older than me, and so everybody was paired off. I always felt like the one who was kind of like shunted into having to do the dishes and clean up after people and just kind of be alone and watch everybody be happy together. I know I would have liked it if somebody had noticed me and just given me a little extra love and attention. And so maybe looking at the single people, or I don't know, if you see any of these kinds of signs, just really taking a minute to connect with them privately, to bring them into the conversation, to just include them a little bit more and ask them questions beyond how are you, what's up, what's new.
Yeah, or just invest in some really good winter wear and take that walk with a friend that you hadn't seen for a while outside. I've done that a couple times in Central Park, and it's been great. And not only will the, like 36 questions and other ways to be more vulnerable to the people around you, but this is a really big plug also for therapy. I mean, if you feel lonely, even if you don't have a mental health issue, like there's something that's screaming out, and really getting in the way of your life, loneliness is still a problem. Like this is something you could get help with. So go to a therapist, like find a local therapist. A lot of people would be very good for this, but work with a therapist on really opening up to those parts of you that you feel ashamed of, feel like it's hard to show others. And be honest with yourself and start to identify maybe some repeated patterns that you do or things that you tend to do to push people away. You know, like we talk a lot about interpersonal dysfunction or personality disorder or like traits, but you might have some kind of tendencies that you're not even aware of, right? That might make it hard for you to turn that acquaintance into a deep, confidant friendship, or there might be something that gets in the way of your romantic relationships or your relationships with your family that you wish were closer and deeper. So, you know, that's where therapy is really for. And that would be not only that, but you might want to elicit feedback from others, right? Like if you feel like you're really not connecting to others, or there might be someone you feel comfortable being like, hey, you know, what happened there? Like what was what drew us away? Like, I really feel sad about that. And I think about that. Like, what would you say was the thing from your perspective on what happened? Not an easy conversation at all, right? But if you're really committed to, if you really notice that this is a chronic problem in your life and you're lonely a lot, getting this kind of feedback might save you another several years of being lonely.
Yeah. Our reaction usually to rejection is to hide and not talk to that person. And it can really help to get that feedback. And also, they may not have known what was happening in your life. It gives you an opportunity to explain yourself a little bit. You know, say things like, I'm sorry, I've been feeling really down. And when I get that way, I'm kind of focused on myself, and I get kind of shut off and maybe defensive, and I didn't realize that other people were experiencing that, and I'm sorry. It opens, again, it's vulnerability is the way forward, and opening to that door to that is super important. Okay, so we hope that this was a little bit helpful for beating the loneliness blues, the holiday blues, and Kibby has some wonderful resources to check out.
Yeah, so we'll put up all the different things that we talked about, the resources we talked about onto the website. So just check out our website for the links that we'll give you. But I would recommend the book Loneliness, Human Nature, and the Need for Social Connection. It's written by Dr. John Cacioppo, who's the leading researcher on loneliness. And he's fantastic. He's a great writer, very beautiful thinker. And I really appreciate how he is trying to spread the awareness of how loneliness is a public health issue. Mm-hmm. It's not just something to be embarrassed about. It's not just a thing that's less important than any other issues. Like, it really, his research has shown that it really affects our mental, physical, spiritual health in many different ways. So I really recommend that book.
Thank you guys again. Please rate, review, and subscribe if you like our podcast. And happy holidays. We will not be releasing an episode next week, but we will see you in the new year. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement.